A girl hugged a crying old man at the hospital, but his words changed her forever. The old man was crying like a child. Not the kind of tears that slipped quietly down wrinkled cheeks, but deep, body-racking sobs that shook his frail frame. His hands trembled in his lap as he sat slouched in the stiff waiting room chair, his breath ragged and broken. No one paid him any mind, just another elderly man lost in his own grief, in a place that reeked of disinfectant and despair. But she saw him. Ava, barely 20, had been in and out of the hospital for days now. Her mother was in room 312, fighting a slow and brutal battle with cancer. Hope came and went like waves. And today, it had gone again. She wasn't in the mood to talk, or feel, or be anything other than numb. But as she passed the waiting room on her way to the vending machine, something about the man's rawness, the way his fingers clenched a worn-out hat like it was the last piece of something sacred, stopped her cold. She didn't think. She just turned, walked over, and sat beside him. And then, without a word, she leaned in and hugged him. He stiffened at first, startled, and then, slowly, like a dam giving way, he melted into her arms. His sobs deepened, but there was a different sound in them now, something ancient and wounded and human. When he finally pulled away, his voice was hoarse. "Why would you do that for me?" Ava looked into his eyes, blue, clouded with time, but still alive. "Because you looked like you needed it," she said. He studied her for a long moment, then looked down at his hands. "I haven't been touched like that in years," he whispered. She didn't know what to say, but she stayed. And that's how it began. That was the moment Ava met Walter. Walter Klein was 84 years old, a retired literature professor, widower, no children, no visitors. The hospital staff called him Mr. Tuesday because he came every week like clockwork, always alone, always to the same bench outside room 408. But there was no one in room 408 anymore. "She died 6 months ago," he told Ava later that day. "My wife, Margaret. But I still come. I don't know why. Maybe I'm hoping one day she'll be there again. Or maybe I'm just not ready to stop pretending." Ava's heart clenched. "Do you talk to her?" she asked gently. Walter smiled, distant and hollow. "Every time. Out loud. People think I'm crazy. Maybe I am. But love doesn't know when to stop." That day, Ava skipped the vending machine. They sat there for almost 2 hours, talking about everything and nothing. About literature. About love. About loss. And when she finally got up to leave, Walter looked at her with eyes that were brighter than before. "Thank you," he said simply. And she felt something stir in her chest that had been quiet for a very long time. It became a ritual. Every day after visiting her mother, Ava would find Walter in the same place, same chair, same silence. Some days he talked. Some days he just stared ahead. But always, Ava sat with him. She learned that he'd taught poetry for 40 years, that he proposed to Margaret with a sonnet, that their only pregnancy had ended in a miscarriage they never talked about again. "Grief never leaves," he told her once. "It just changes clothes. Some days it looks like sadness. Other days, it looks like silence. But it's always there, like a shadow that never needs light." Ava began to realize she was learning more from this man than from anyone else in her life. And then one day, it happened. The day that changed everything. It had been a hard night. Her mother had had a seizure. The doctors said it was expected, but nothing about it had felt normal. Ava hadn't slept. Her nerves were raw. Her hope, thin as thread. She found Walter at the usual spot. He greeted her with a weak smile, but the minute he looked at her face, the smile faded. "Bad night?" She nodded, her throat tight. They sat in silence for a while. Then Walter reached into his coat and pulled out a faded envelope. Carefully, like it was something sacred, he handed it to her. "What's this?" It's something I wrote. For Margaret. But I never gave it to her. I was saving it for when she got better." Ava looked down at the envelope, yellowed with time. "I want you to have it." She opened her mouth to protest, but his gaze silenced her. With trembling fingers, she opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Written in beautiful cursive, nearly faded with age, was a poem. And as she read it, her eyes filled with tears. It wasn't just a poem. It was a confession, a plea, a promise. It spoke of regret, of longing, of undying devotion. It was raw. It was beautiful. It was love in its most naked form. When she looked up, Walter's eyes were glassy. "I never got to say goodbye the way I wanted," he whispered. "And maybe I never will. But if my words can help someone else, then maybe they weren't wasted." Ava didn't speak. She just hugged him again. This time, he cried without shame. And when she left the hospital that day, she didn't just feel sad. She felt changed. The next morning, Walter didn't come. Nor the next. Ava asked around, but no one had seen him. Room 408 was still empty. 3 days later, she found a nurse who finally gave her an answer. He collapsed at home, the nurse said. Heart failure. He's in room 223 now. But he's not doing well. Ava ran. She found him hooked up to machines, his chest rising and falling like waves struggling against the shore. His eyes opened when he heard her voice. You came, he murmured. She nodded, tears falling freely now. I'm not done learning from you yet, she said, her voice breaking. Walter smiled faintly. Then listen closely. He took her hand, weak and cold. You have to live, Ava. Don't spend your life in waiting rooms. Don't talk to ghosts. Say the things. Hug the people. Love without fear. That's the only thing that matters in the end. His eyes fluttered. And then he said something she would never forget. Tell Margaret, I was never strong enough to leave the room. But I waited. I always waited. And then he closed his eyes. He died that night. Peacefully. Quietly. Ava stayed until the very end. And when she walked out of that hospital the next morning, everything looked different. The sky seemed bluer. The air, sharper. She held the poem close to her chest. And in that moment, she knew. Walter hadn't just given her his words. He'd given her the courage to write her own. The funeral was small. No family. No church. Just a few nurses from the hospital and Ava, standing in a light drizzle beside a modest casket. She wore black. Though Walter had once joked he preferred green, Margaret always said it made my eyes pop. A detail she now clung to like a thread through grief. Ava spoke when the priest asked if anyone wanted to say something. She stepped forward, her hands shaking as she held the faded poem Walter had given her. Rain dotted the paper, but she didn't flinch. I didn't know Walter long, she began, her voice trembling but clear. But in just a few weeks, he taught me more about love, loss, and being alive than most people learn in a lifetime. She looked at the casket. You were never a stranger, Walter. You were a teacher until the end. She tucked the poem into the casket before it was lowered. I hope Margaret's waiting. After the burial, Ava found herself walking aimlessly through the streets. She didn't want to go home. Not yet. Something inside her had shifted, and she didn't know how to return to who she was before. The city was alive around her, oblivious to the quiet ache in her chest. People hurried past, absorbed in phones, routines, and destinations. But to Ava, everything felt suspended like time had tilted slightly off-center. She ended up at a park bench the same type Walter used to sit on. And as the afternoon light filtered through the trees, she pulled out a notebook. Walter's poem had inspired her. But now she needed to write her own. The pen shook in her hand at first. The words didn't come easily. But then she remembered Walter's voice, soft and insistent. Say the things. So she did. She wrote to her mother. To the little girl she used to be. To the fears she didn't know how to name. To Walter. And as the words spilled onto the page, something inside her began to settle. Not heal, exactly, but soften. She stayed on that bench for hours. By the time she left, her notebook was 3 pages heavier in her chest, just a little lighter. A week later, her mother passed. Ava was there, holding her hand. Unlike Walter's passing, which had been quiet and sudden, her mother's had been slow, drawn out over days of slipping in and out of consciousness. But when it finally happened, it was peaceful, almost gentle. There were no dramatic goodbyes. Just a whisper of breath, a final squeeze of her hand, and silence. Ava didn't cry right away. There was something too deep for tears, a stillness that settled over her like snowfall. She sat in the room for hours, the machines unplugged, her mother's hand still in hers. When the nurse came in to check on her, she simply said, "I'm not ready yet." And the nurse nodded. Grief had taught them both patience. The days that followed were a blur. Phone calls, paperwork, a small cremation ceremony. There were moments when Ava felt like she was floating above herself, watching a stranger go through the motions of mourning. But late at night, in the quiet of her apartment, the pain would crawl back in. She tried to keep busy. She filled pages in her notebook. She read poetry the kind Walter had once quoted without effort. She even went back to the hospital one day, sat on the bench outside room 408, and whispered, "Thank you." The bench felt different without him. Colder. Still, she stayed a while. Let herself remember. That night, she dreamed of Walter and Margaret sitting in that room, reading together by the window, their hands entwined. One afternoon, nearly 2 months after both losses, Ava received a letter. There was no return address. The handwriting was careful, old-fashioned. She opened it slowly, puzzled. Inside was a short note on ivory paper. Dear Ava, Walter told me about you. I was Margaret's sister. I live in Maine. I only found out about Walter's passing last week through a family friend. He never reached out to any of us after Margaret died. But he talked about you, said you reminded him of her. He left a small box for you in his will. I've enclosed the key and the address of the lawyer handling his estate. He said you'd know what to do with it. Thank you for being there for him. With warmth. Helen Ashcroft. Ava stared at the letter for a long time. He'd left her something. She didn't even know he had a will. The office was a quiet little place downtown, filled with old books and dust-covered lamps. The lawyer, a man in his 70s, greeted her like she was family. Walter spoke very highly of you, he said. Said you brought light into his final weeks. He handed her a small wooden box with a brass clasp. He asked that you open this somewhere quiet, somewhere meaningful. Ava took the box in both hands. It was heavier than it looked. That night, she drove out to the lake where her mother used to take her as a child. She sat on the old dock, legs dangling over the edge, the box resting in her lap. The sun was setting. She opened it. Inside were 3 things. A photograph Walter and Margaret in their 20s, standing under a tree in full bloom, arms around each other, radiant with joy. A first-edition copy of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. Walter had once called it his true Bible. And a letter. She unfolded it with care. Ava, I never believed in accidents. Only intersections. You were not an accident. You were a gift. A second chance at saying what I never got to say. If you're reading this, I hope the world hasn't hardened you. I hope grief hasn't taken the softness from your heart. Keep writing. Keep hugging. And remember, some rooms are meant to be left. But love should never stay inside them. Yours in the echoes. Walter. Ava pressed the letter to her chest. She cried for him, for her mother, for everything that had changed. Then she whispered, I'll carry it forward, Walter. I promise. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something like peace. Months passed. Ava applied to graduate school. Not in science, like her mother had wanted, but in literature. She quoted Walter's words in her application essay. I met a man who waited every day for someone he loved. He taught me that grief is not weakness. It's love surviving. And writing. Writing is how I survive. She got accepted. The first day of class, she carried the Leaves of Grass book in her backpack. That same day, she started a blog. She titled it Room 408. Her first post went viral. It was the story of the day she hugged a crying old man in the hospital, and how everything changed after that. In the weeks that followed, Ava's blog began to grow beyond anything she expected. People from all over the country, nurses, daughters, sons, widows, strangers started sending messages. They told their own stories of grief, of grandparents who passed away, of fathers who never said, I love you, of regrets left unspoken. And in every comment, Ava saw the same thing. People were desperate to be heard. Just like Walter had been. She responded to every message. Some with long replies, some with just a heart. But she answered, because it mattered. Because she knew what silence could do to a soul. One night, she posted a new entry. Not about Walter. Not about her mother. But about herself. I used to be afraid to feel too much. I thought grief would break me. But then I met a man who cried in a hospital hallway. And I learned that the things we run from, pain, vulnerability, the ache of loving someone who's no longer here, those are the things that connect us most deeply. I'm not afraid anymore. The post spread faster than any before. It was shared by mental health advocates, elderly care workers, even teachers who read it aloud in class. And then the email started. Requests to speak, to write a book, to come talk to students. Ava was overwhelmed. But one request stood out. A hospice care center reached out, asking if she would consider volunteering. Not to clean or organize, but to sit with people. To simply be there, the way she had been with Walter. Ava stared at the email for a long time. And then she replied, yes, I'd be honored. Her first visit was to a woman named Lorraine. She was 91, sharp as a tack, dying of congestive heart failure. I don't want to be read to, she snapped when Ava sat down beside her. Ava smiled gently. Okay, then let's just talk. Lorraine blinked. Talk about what? Anything. Or nothing. They sat in silence for 10 minutes. Then Lorraine suddenly said, "You remind me of my granddaughter." Ava turned. "Yeah. She never visits." "I'm here now," Ava said. Lorraine didn't say anything, but her fingers found Ava's hand. And they stayed like that for the rest of the hour. Ava left that day with something new inside her. A sense of purpose. A calling. Something more than grief. Over time, she became a fixture at the hospice. Patients requested her. Nurses looked forward to her visits. She read poetry. She held hands. She listened. She never pretended to fix anything. She just showed up, and somehow that was enough. She thought often of Walter, of his voice, his stories, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about Margaret. She imagined what he would say if he could see her now. Probably quote Whitman. Probably smile and say, "Told you words matter." On the anniversary of Walter's death, Ava returned to the hospital. Room 408 was now occupied by someone else. So she sat on the bench outside. Same spot. Same chair. She placed a small bouquet beside her and opened her notebook. "You changed me," she wrote. "And I'm changing others. Your love didn't end with Margaret. It found its way to me. And now it's moving through every story I tell. You didn't wait in vain." She closed the notebook, looked up at the ceiling, and smiled. "Still waiting, old man," she whispered. A breeze stirred the leaves outside the window. She took it as a yes. Months passed. Fall came, and the trees burned orange and gold like torches leading Ava somewhere she didn't fully understand yet. Her classes at graduate school were intense, but for the first time in her life, the exhaustion felt purposeful. She was pursuing what she loved. Words, meaning, memory. One day, in a seminar on memoir writing, the professor asked the students to bring in a piece of writing that had shaped their lives. Some students brought excerpts from Toni Morrison, Hemingway, or Baldwin. Ava brought Walter's poem. She stood in front of the class, holding the faded sheet of paper. Her voice trembled only slightly as she read it aloud, his words like a ghost still living in her lungs. When she finished, the room was silent. The professor wiped at his eyes and said softly, "I hope you're writing your own story now." Ava nodded. "I am." That night, she began outlining a book. Not just about Walter, but about the entire journey. Her mother, her grief, her growth, and the small, unshakable truth that one quiet human encounter, one hug in a hospital could change everything. 3 months into the semester, she got a letter from Helen Ashcroft, again Margaret's sister. It was handwritten, as before. "Dear Ava, I hope this finds you well. I'm writing with news. I've been going through Margaret and Walter's attic. In a box labeled for someday, I found a stack of letters, one for each year they were married. He wrote them, but never gave them to her. I've read a few. They're beautiful, heartbreaking, tender. I think they belong in the world. If you ever want to read them or even publish them, I'd be honored to share them with you. Warmly, Helen." Ava read the letter 3 times. Then she packed a bag, bought a train ticket to Maine, and went to meet Helen in person. The two women embraced at the front door like family. Helen was in her 70s, elegant in a quiet way, her eyes watery but sharp. "Margaret would have loved you," she said over tea. In the attic, they opened the old box together. Inside were 62 letters. One for every year. Walter had dated each one, written in his spidery script. Helen placed a few in Ava's hands and said, "You decide what to do with them." Back in her apartment, Ava read the first 10 letters in one sitting. She cried through almost all of them. They weren't just love letters. They were chronicles of a man trying to hold onto something sacred while the world kept moving. Letters about the day Margaret got a diagnosis. About how he held her after a bad dream. About how he couldn't stop missing her even when she was right there. Each one ended with a line that crushed Ava's heart in the best way. "Still yours, still waiting." She knew, then, what she needed to do. She wrote to a publisher. Sent them 5 letters and an essay she'd written about Walter. A week later, she got a phone call. The editor on the other end of the line said, "We'd like to publish the book. We think the world needs to hear this man's voice." Ava whispered, "Me too." The book was released in the spring. They titled it Still Waiting, The Letters of Walter Klein. Ava wrote the foreword, telling the story of how she met Walter in the hospital hallway. It wasn't a bestseller, but it didn't need to be, because the people who found it found something they didn't know they needed. Readers sent letters to the publisher addressed simply to Walter, and Ava answered them. She printed them all, put them in a binder marked, "The room he never left." The hospice center asked Ava to speak at a benefit event that summer. It was a black tie affair, full of donors and doctors. But when Ava took the stage, she didn't speak like a fundraiser. She spoke like a granddaughter, like a daughter, like someone who had once hugged a crying old man in a hallway and never walked away. "I used to think that pain was the end of something," she told the crowd. "But I've learned it's often the beginning of listening, of connection, of truth." She paused. "I met Walter by accident. But love isn't an accident. It's a choice. It's a return. It's someone sitting beside you when the world forgets you exist." Silence. Then applause. And more than one person dabbing at their eyes. That night, an older woman approached her afterward. "My husband died 3 years ago," she said, holding Ava's hand. "I never got to say goodbye. But reading those letters, it helped me finally do that." Ava smiled. Walter would be so happy to know that. In the quiet months that followed, Ava kept writing. She taught a writing workshop for seniors at a community center. She titled it, "Letters You Never Sent." At first, the room was tense. Some of the elderly participants laughed nervously, others looked away. But by the second week, the letters began to come. One to a daughter who hadn't spoken to her father in decades. One to a wife long gone. One to a best friend who had died in war. They read them aloud, tears flowing freely. And something in the room shifted. They weren't just old anymore. They were storytellers, carriers of history, people who still had something to say. And Ava was there to receive it all. One day, she stayed behind after class to talk with Mr. Lionel, a retired postman who had been quiet all semester. "I haven't written my letter yet," he said. "That's okay," Ava replied. "Some letters take longer to find." He hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. "This is for my son," he whispered. "We haven't spoken in 17 years. Ava took the envelope gently. "Do you want me to help send it?" He nodded. "I think I'm ready." She mailed it that afternoon. 2 weeks later, Lionel came to class beaming. "He called me," he said, voice shaking. "He called me." Ava just hugged him. Because sometimes, all you can do is hold the miracle when it arrives. On the 1-year anniversary of the book's release, Ava received an invitation. A hospital in New York was building a new wing. They wanted to name the waiting area after someone whose story had moved patients and staff alike. They asked for her permission to name it the Walter Klein Reflection Room. She flew out that summer, stood in front of the new room, glass walls, soft lighting, a quiet place with poetry on the walls and benches facing a garden courtyard. One of Walter's poems was framed by the door, and beneath it, in small bronze letters, "Love doesn't end when someone leaves the room." Ava placed her hand on the plaque, closed her eyes. "I'm here, Walter," she whispered, "and I'm still listening." That evening, after the dedication ceremony at the hospital, Ava stayed behind after everyone else had left. The soft hum of the air vents, the scent of newly polished wood, and the distant beeping of machines beyond the corridor, all of it reminded her of that very first day. The day she met a crying old man who would change her forever. She sat down on one of the new benches facing the garden and pulled out her notebook, now dog-eared and stained with time. She began to write, not for a blog, not for a publisher, just for Walter. "Dear Walter, they named a room after you. A real one, with windows and benches and poems. People will sit here for years to come, and they'll read your words. Some will cry, some won't, but they'll feel something. You once said love should never stay inside a room. But now, I think it should live in one, too. A room where people can rest, remember, heal. You gave me that gift, and now you're giving it to the world. Still yours, still grateful. Ava." She closed the notebook, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel haunted by absence. She felt filled. In the months that followed, Ava continued her work, writing, teaching, listening. She spoke at universities, led grief circles, mentored young writers. And then one day, something happened that she couldn't have anticipated. She received a letter from a young woman in Iowa, 17 years old, just lost her grandfather. She had found Ava's book in a thrift store. "I don't know why I'm writing," the girl said. "Maybe because I'm scared. Maybe because you sound like someone who would understand. I don't want to forget him, but I don't know how to remember him either." Ava wrote back, not with answers, but with questions. What did he laugh like? What stories did he tell more than once? What's the one thing you wish you could ask him right now? The girl replied a week later. 3 pages. All answers. All memories. All tears. Ava printed that letter and tucked it into her binder. The binder now had a new name. The Legacy of Listening. And it was growing. One rainy afternoon, Ava returned once more to the hospice center. Not to volunteer this time, but to visit Lorraine, the sharp-tongued woman she had met months ago. Lorraine had taken a turn. The nurses said she didn't have long. When Ava entered the room, Lorraine opened her eyes weakly and smirked. "Still writing about me, kid?" Ava laughed through her tears. "Always." Lorraine patted the side of the bed. "Sit down. I've got something to give you." From beneath the blanket, she pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. Yellowed, torn at the corners. "My husband wrote that to me the day before he died. I never showed it to anyone, but I want you to have it." Ava opened the letter, carefully. The words were simple, full of devotion. Raw, quiet, honest love. "You keep collecting hearts, don't you?" Lorraine whispered. "Make sure you take care of yours, too." Ava leaned in and kissed her hand. "I will." Lorraine passed that night, and Ava stayed by her side, holding the letter. Another soul, another story, added to the legacy. Now, the binder is over 200 letters thick. Some are typed, some handwritten in shaky lines, some sent through email, others found in drawers, given by relatives, strangers, caretakers. And Ava keeps them all. She reads them when she forgets why she started, when she misses Walter, when she doubts whether any of it really matters. Each letter says the same thing in its own way. We are still here. We still love. We remember. And Ava smiles every time she reads them. Because somewhere, she knows, Walter is smiling too. 2 years later, Ava sat at a bookstore cafe in Portland, Maine. Outside, the snow fell in delicate spirals, brushing against the window glass like the quiet knock of memory. She was there for a book signing, not just any book, but her second. This one was hers entirely. Not Walter's letters, not someone else's grief, but her journey, her voice. The title, What Love Leaves Behind. The dedication was simple. For Walter, who taught me what stories can carry. The store was modest, tucked between a bakery and a vintage record shop, but the line stretched out the door. Some people carried both her books. Some just wanted to say thank you. Ava smiled as each reader stepped forward, some shy, some shaking, some with tears in their eyes. And every time she signed her name, she paused and asked, "Whose story are you carrying today?" They always answered, "A grandmother, a best friend, a lost partner, a daughter gone too soon." They whispered names like prayers. And Ava received each one with a quiet nod, a human acknowledgement, because she knew what it meant to carry someone. Later that night, as the cafe lights dimmed and the store closed, Ava sat alone at her corner table. She opened her binder, The Legacy of Listening, and carefully slid in a new letter. It was from a young hospice nurse in Wisconsin. She had read Ava's book to a patient in his final days. He hadn't spoken in weeks, but during the reading, he opened his eyes, squeezed her hand, and whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore." The nurse had written to Ava afterward, saying, "I don't know what happened in that moment, but I think your words gave him peace. Thank you." Ava closed the binder and cried, not because she was sad, but because it was working. Walter's words, her words, the stories people were finally telling. It was all rippling outward, one quiet act of humanity at a time. Spring came, then summer. One golden afternoon, Ava visited a retirement home outside Boston to speak at a community event for seniors and their families. It was a casual setting, folding chairs, lemonade, kids running between old men and walkers. She sat next to a woman named Dolores who had been a piano teacher for 40 years. "You write stories?" Dolores asked, sipping iced tea. "I write people," Ava replied. Dolores laughed. "Then I hope you write this part down. I kissed my husband for the first time in a tornado shelter." Ava grinned. "Go on." And so Dolores did. For an hour, they sat beneath a maple tree while she recounted a life made of music, storms, grief, and an entire love story that had never once been written down. At the end, Dolores touched Ava's notebook and said, "If you don't tell it, it dies with me." Ava promised she would. And she did. That story became the opening chapter of her next book. In August, Ava was invited to give a TED Talk. She almost said no. The stage, the spotlight, the camera sit felt too big. Walter would have hated it. But the night before the decision deadline, she walked past a hospital near her apartment and saw a young woman crying in the parking lot. Without thinking, Ava approached her. "Are you okay?" The girl shook her head. "My dad's in there. It's not good." Ava didn't ask questions. She just opened her arms. And the girl leaned in, crying, breathing, breaking, healing. Ava whispered, "You don't have to do this alone." Later that night, Ava wrote to the TED organizers. "I'm in." The stage lights were blinding, the room silent. But Ava's voice was steady. She spoke without notes. From memory, from the scar that had become her cinder. "I once hugged a crying old man in a hospital hallway," she began. "He was grieving, and I didn't know what to say. So I didn't say anything. I just sat with him. And that moment changed my life." She told the story of Walter, of the letters, of Margaret, of room 408. She told the story of how listening became her way of loving, how pain didn't have to be loud to matter. And then she looked at the crowd and asked, "Who have you been too afraid to write to?" Silence. Some tears. Some gasps. A pause that felt like truth itself. She ended with a quote from one of Walter's final letters. "If grief is love with nowhere to go, then writing is the road we build to take it somewhere." The audience stood, not out of habit, but because something in them had shifted. They carried someone new now. They carried Walter. Backstage, Ava sat in a quiet corner, exhausted but whole. Her phone buzzed. A text from her editor. Walter's book just hit the New York Times extended list. "You did it." Ava smiled. "No," she texted back. "We did it." Years later, Ava would become a professor. Not of literature exactly, but of memory studies, a small, rare program at a liberal arts college in Vermont. She taught a class called The Unsent Letter. Every semester, she opened with the same story. A girl once hugged a crying old man in a hospital, and he gave her everything he had left, his words. Now she's here, and so are you. The students never forgot it, and by the end of each course, they left behind hundreds of unsent letters. Ava kept them all, archived them, honored them, because she understood that grief, like love, needs a home, and sometimes that home is a piece of paper and someone willing to read it. On the 10th anniversary of Walter's death, Ava returned to the hospital where it all began. The Walter Klein Reflection Room had become something sacred. Patients left notes on the windowsill, tucked poems into the cracks of the benches. Nurses lit candles on the windowsill at night. Ava placed a fresh flower at the door, and she sat. She closed her eyes. She whispered, "I kept my promise." She opened her notebook one last time and began to write. "Dear stranger, if you found this bench, maybe you've lost someone too. Maybe you're waiting. Maybe you're breaking. I was once a stranger here too. But someone saw me, sat with me, hugged me, and that changed everything. So here I am, still listening, still writing, and I hope you will too." She closed the notebook and left it on the bench. A gift for the next story, a place for love to go. The end.